So my name is Josh Gellers, and I am a political scientist who found his way into writing about robots, mainly because of my background in environmental rights. And I know that you have a presentation today from the person who inspired me to write on this topic, Dr. David Gunkel. So things that I've been writing about sort of extended from his introduction to the field of robot ethics, and I really owe him a debt of gratitude for getting me on this course. This presentation was originally delivered as part of an IEEE working group on design-centered human-robot interaction and governance meeting. And so what you're going to see today is not yet in the form of a paper, but is my effort to try and take robot ethics and translate it into design criteria that can function in a regulatory way in the absence of national or international regulations governing the creation of robots. And I'm going to try and keep my remarks to within the sort of 15 to 20-minute range so that we can leave plenty of time for questions and answers. To begin, this is just a brief overview of the direction that I'm going to go. I'm going to talk very briefly about the literature on robot ethics, then specify the nature of interactions between levels of analysis, talk about the importance of iteration, briefly describe different approaches to regulation. Then I'm going to give examples of ways in which design can be purposeful in regulation, provide an example, then I will expound my framework and then conclude with some final thoughts. So the literature on robot ethics has been around for a couple of decades now, but we are now finally crystallizing around some common themes. And this is an excellent paper from last year that tries to summarize the state of knowledge about the main ideas and concepts relevant to robot ethics. And so I just sort of graphically represented them here, and you can scan the QR code in case you're curious about accessing the original document. So in general, Torres talks about there being sort of three categories of ethical issues: those that pertain to justice, those that pertain to freedom, and those that pertain to responsibility. And within those themes, there are 5 different sort of groups. So ethical concerns dealing with human dignity, human autonomy, robot transparency, emotional bonding, and privacy and safety. So while this is not necessarily an absolutely exhaustive list of the kinds of ethical concerns relevant to robots, it's a pretty indicative one that I think provides us with a good foundation for thinking through some of the issues that inhere in human-robot interaction. This is taken from an article later turned into a book by one of my co-authors and co-editors, Henrik Setra, and I really find this valuable because it allows us to think about the knock-on effects of our decisions regarding AI in general and robots in particular. So as you can see here, he separates levels of analysis into the macro, meso, and micro scales. So macro could be global, interplanetary, meso could be more at the national or regional level, and then micro we might think about in terms of dyadic relationships between, say, a human and a robot, or within a household, or within a particular institution like a school. And that there are interaction effects between these categories, and then each one of them may have direct or indirect effects, and those can be scaled in terms of having high, medium, or low impacts. So this is just a way of, and you could apply this to lots of different things, but I think it's particularly valuable here in the context of robot design and robot regulation. Another thing that's important, as we'll see later, is the role that iteration plays. So what we don't want is for robots to be designed in a one-off way and that we don't learn anything useful from our trials and experiments. So this one paper by Drew Karch and others argues in favor of using a particular toolkit which robot developers will use to inform their designs to make sure that they're in compliance with regulations. But then the important thing is that this is a feedback loop. So as we learn more about the ways in which robots are working in the real world and the kinds of regulations that are being passed, we work to refine and improve the way that we design robots in light of changing circumstances and the evolving regulatory landscape. Now, I'm a political scientist, so I think this is really important, and I see this as a bit of an oversight in a lot of the literature on the regulation of AI writ large, and that is to think about the suite of different regulatory approaches. And so in international law, we think of this as arrayed on a spectrum that refers to the level of bindingness that a particular measure has. So that is a scale from everything from very low levels of bindingness, where we're just asking people to do this for their own interests or asking people voluntarily to contribute, all the way up through high levels of bindingness like hard law. And so I wanted to just sort of provide a broad overview of the kinds of approaches that are out there right now. It's very fitting that sort of the first image is one of Ishiguro, who, not to say that Japan doesn't have its own regulations, but is largely driven by a kind of desire to make maximally human-like robots. And so that requires, in the absence of any sort of hard law, a sort of self-regulation. And a lot of the way that robot design is happening right now tends to be focused on that sort of lower side of bindingness. Then a sort of higher level are voluntary standards. And these are things like ISO, IEEE. Here's another example from last year, Shanghai's Guidelines for Humanoid Robot Governance, which I believe is the first sort of quasi-legal document of its kind. Although, again, it requires sort of voluntary participation. It is not the same thing as sort of a statute that would require compliance, and there would be penalties for not adhering to it. Then we have international soft law, like we've seen to being developed at the UN level. This is one of the sort of recent foundational documents governing AI for humanity, which interestingly doesn't really mention robots very much, if at all, but it shows you that the international community is working towards developing some kind of international agreements, international declarations, even though at this point we don't have anything like an international treaty that's binding on state members. And then finally, we have regional or national laws. The United States sort of famously just withdrew some of its own approaches while actually enacting legislation that pertains to the use of deepfakes. But the most well-known example of regional law would probably be the EU's AI Act, which again, while not directly relating to robotics, does, because of its nature, interfacing with AI, provide a kind of roadmap for how AI should be governed in particular, especially under a kind of risk-based model. So this is just an overview of the different kinds of regulation that are out there. And what I'm seeking to do today is to intervene with what I hope to be a very fruitful approach in the absence of hard law, which is regulation by design. So to that end, there's sort of three different examples of this that I want to discuss very briefly. Prifty et al. Talk about regulation by design as being this kind of meso-level perspective, which again is more than just asking designers to play nicely, or on the other end of the spectrum, having hard law with punitive measures for noncompliance. But we can think of different sort of schools of thought within regulation by design. Chan wrote a wonderful article in 2018, which talks a lot about the role of sustainability and environmental concerns in what he calls design ethics, which really refers to the role that that ethics plays in the issues that come up in the process of designing products. And this requires thought about what those ethics are by the developer, but also, we can specify the sort of ethical approaches that we want our industry to take, and hopefully those wind up being funneled into the things that they produce. He also, this is kind of a bridge, mentions that at present we don't really have a good way of doing the middle icon here, which is more than human design. Although with the increasing use of artificial intelligence, I think it's going to be more and more likely that we will have ways of tapping into the interests of non-human entities like nature and animals. For instance, we have work being done to decode whale speech and dolphin speech. There's a project happening where they're trying to decode the interests of forests by capturing sound. So we're seeing technology being utilized to create a platform for thinking about and incorporating the interests of the more than human world. There are efforts like Moth at NYU, Project SETI, which I mentioned, dealing with whales, animals in the room, that all in one way or another try and figure out what those more than human elements are and how to bring them into the fold of design. So the next one is Design Justice. And this is based off a book by Costanza Chalk, and it has been used in the context of robots by the authors below, Ostrowski and Brazil, to talk about how we can provide a more participatory approach to robot design in a way that reflects the interests of not only stakeholders, but the most vulnerable people who could be impacted by the widespread deployment of robots. And so what I'm arguing here is that these are all important elements of a broader umbrella that we might consider to be regulation by design. And I'm going to show what this looks like in a framework that I propose in a minute. But there's an example that, even though it was prior to some of the work that I just cited, that I think invokes the spirit of what I'm trying to achieve here, and that is an old article by Amy Van Wensberg called, or that refers to care-centered value-sensitive design. So value-sensitive design has been around for a while, but she adds to this a kind of feminist ethic, which is centered on the role of care in these relations. And she highlights 5 different types of factors that should be taken into account when seeking to implement care-centered value-sensitive design. And these include the context in which a robot is being deployed, the practice, what is the robot actually doing, the actors involved, are they, in this case, an end user like an elderly person, are they medical personnel, are they children, the type of robot, is it going to be sort of heavily embodied like a humanoid robot like Pepper? Is it going to be slightly more disembodied like we might find, Siri or Alexa? And then what are the sort of moral elements involved here? So what are the sort of moral concerns, moral values, and how are they intersecting with the factors that precede it? And so I think that this is a really helpful way of grounding ourselves in what this could look like, and I'm seeking to add on to it some of my own ideas. So what this looks like is a nascent framework I'm proposing that incorporates essentially all of these different things into, as you see here, kind of a linear framework that has a sort of iterative aspect at the end. So in line with people like David Gunkel, who have talked about the importance of beginning with ethics and letting that dictate our interactions, sort of the tenor of our interactions with non-humans, especially robots. So we have to already ground ourselves in what those ethics are at the outset. Then consider the context in which a robot is being used. Then engage in the co-design of standards, which means having the stakeholders play an active role in the design of the robots. Then going to pilot prototypes that we see in the real world and figuring out what works and what does not, going back to the drawing board and making adjustments, which is the next step, and then actually deploying them in the real world, monitoring and continuously evaluating their use and maybe misuse or abuse, and then continually working to make adjustments to iterate and improve upon those initial designs. And so I'm arguing that this process is a way of infusing design within in a way in which we can accomplish some of the goals of regulation. So to conclude, robot regulation should always and already begins with ethics, how we think about the world. So at base, we need to really come to an agreement about what those ethics should look like, although we may wind up in a situation because of different jurisdictions that there are sort of pluriversal ways of thinking about ethics. So maybe not imposing a single universal ethics from the top down, but thinking very contextually about the ethics that are relevant in any given area. The approach that we adopt should be interactive and iterative. We should seek to overcome the hard law regulatory gap, at least for the time being, by implementing some of these measures while governments are figuring out what to do nationally and whether there is an interest in doing something like this at the international level, which thus far there hasn't been a lot of interest outside of the European Union. So advocate in favor of, as at least as a potential interim solution, regulation by design, and that a framework for robot regulation by design should incorporate some of the schools of thought that I described earlier: design ethics, more than human design, and design justice. So I know that was sort of a whirlwind tour through an approach that I'm advocating for. I am happy to answer any and all of your questions. And in case you want to maintain contact with me and communicate offline, feel free to reach out to me via email or Blue Sky or LinkedIn and any of those things. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to all of your questions.